Hi everyone. I just want to thank you for coming. This event is hosted by Students for Human Life. I'm the president of that group. We're a pro-life group on campus that seeks to promote life from conception until natural death. Our speaker tonight is Melissa Ohden. She's the survivor of a saline abortion, and she's just going to give her testimony, and then there's going to be Q&A afterwards. So thank you for coming, and let's welcome Melissa Ohden.
Okay, I have to ask, I heard there's maybe students from the med school here, is that right? I always kind of like to know if you're with the med school, raise your hand. Thank you. And Republicans? Oh, woohoo! All right. Well, of course, not that those two things aren't synonymous somehow together, but I always like to know who's present. How many people had heard of an abortion survivor before you came tonight or before you saw the flyer? A handful of you? Yeah. And typically, I know some of the folks in the medical community will have heard of abortion survivors. You know, what I'm here tonight to do is to share a perspective with you about abortion that you don't often hear about in our society, which is the perspective of a child. You know, we've lost 56 million children in 40 years of legalized abortion in the United States alone. And I was meant to be one of those 56 million. You know, what you'll gather from me tonight is, yes, I obviously have a strong faith. That is part of how I am who I am. And people in the medical community understand there is no medical reason why anyone like me survives a failed abortion. So my faith is a huge part of my life, but I also understand about the sanctity of life from a scientific standpoint. And, you know, that is something that people can't ever point to in my life, is when it was that my life supposedly began. So what I'm here tonight, like I said, is to just share a perspective that you've never heard before. And it's not just about me surviving an abortion. What I'm here to tell you about tonight is the impact that abortion has on all of us. You know, someone came through the door tonight asking about when the food was going to be delivered later. I get that. Been a college student, understand completely. The food will be coming later, by the way, if anybody else is wondering. Don't worry. But they were, you know, saying, well, you know, it's really not my thing. It really doesn't, you know, fit with my world. And the truth is, whether you think it does or not, the truth is that abortion touches each and every one of our lives. And what I'm here to talk to you about tonight is how abortion has affected my entire family. Because it isn't just my life that was supposed to end by an abortion. My entire family was forever changed for future generations to come by that one decision that was made 36 years ago to end my life. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. And then I want to give you the opportunity to just engage in some conversation about it. You know, please know when it is time for question and answer, there is nothing that you can't ask me. You know, I always like to think I've been asked just about everything, but, you know, then somebody asks me a question that blows me away. So, you know, feel free to ask me anything after a while. But, you know, my life 36 years ago started in Iowa. Anybody been to Sioux City, Iowa? Yeah, quite a few people. In Minnesota territory, that's pretty normal. I actually now live in Kansas City, and whenever I travel around the world, because I not only travel across the United States and Canada, but I also go to Australia from time to time. And people's response usually when I say I'm from the Midwest or I'm from Iowa, they go, oh, I'm so sorry. You don't need to feel sorry for me. You know, I had a really good childhood growing up in Iowa, and I'm sure many of you have had, you know, good childhoods growing up in the Midwest. But it was 36 years ago that my life was supposed to end by an abortion right there in Sioux City, Iowa. And what I know about my biological mother is that she fits most statistics when it comes to abortion. We know that college-aged women are primary targets for abortion, and of course, primary consumers of the product of abortion. And my biological mother was a freshman in college when she found herself with an unplanned pregnancy. My biological parents actually had been engaged at the time that they found themselves with that unplanned pregnancy. They had dated throughout high school into college. And what I know now is that they were actually madly in love with one another. And then they found themselves with this unplanned pregnancy. And unfortunately, my biological parents weren't given any other option than to have the abortion that was meant to end my life. You know, we live in this world that talks about abortion being a choice and a right. And what I always have to point out to people is that statistics still today identify that over 64% of women report being coerced into having an abortion. 64%. So it's not their choice. Someone else makes that choice for them or puts them in the position that it's the only choice available to them. And I always have to say, where's the empowerment in that? If 64% of women are put in the position that it's not their choice. And 36 years ago, it wasn't my biological mother's choice to have that saline infusion abortion that was meant to end my life. You know, I had family members, when they found out that she was pregnant with me, actually offered to have her live with them. My parents wanted to marry one another and raise me. But my grandmother, my biological mother's mother, was a prominent nurse in the community and was not pleased to have her daughter pregnant at the age of 19. And so my grandmother, the nurse, orchestrated the abortion that should have ended my life. My biological mother was literally forced to abort me. A saline infusion was started for that abortion, and for those of you who aren't aware of what it involves injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding that preborn child in the womb. And the intent of that toxic salt solution is to scald the child to death from the outside in. You can read about it in the medical journals or look at it online, and you can read how children like me are actually called the red-skinned or the candy-appled babies because that toxic salt solution turns the skin bright red as it peels it away and moves internally into the organs. My biological mother's abortion should have been completed within about 72 hours. The child soaks in that toxic salt solution, is scalded to death, and then premature labor is induced with the intention of delivering a deceased child. For some unknown reason, my biological mother's abortion took place over 5 days, 2 days longer than what it even should have. And so I soaked in that toxic salt solution. And you know what? I can't imagine what it was like, not only for me to fight for my life, but what it was like for my biological mother over those 5 days. You know, to know that she didn't want to have that abortion, that it was literally forced upon her, and that she probably felt me fighting for my life in the womb, because I've met other women who had the same type of abortion procedure and actually felt their children thrashing about in the womb before they ultimately lost their life. And that abortion was completed on my biological mother, thinking she was less than 5 months pregnant with me. But the fact that I was delivered on the 5th day of that procedure and was able to survive, and I weighed a little less than 3 pounds. I was 2 pounds, 14 ounces when I survived. Those things indicate that she was much further along in her pregnancy than what they had imagined. And that's true, because when I obtained my medical records in recent years that do detail the abortion that I survived, those medical records, one of the first notations by a doctor in them is that I looked like I was about 31 weeks gestational age when I survived. 31 weeks. So you can only imagine what my biological mother must have felt as I was being scalded to death in the womb. You're probably wondering the same thing everyone else does when I mention those little pieces already. A child being scalded to death, delivered prematurely, 31 weeks. And you're thinking, how does this happen? You know, as I shared, there is no medical reason that the doctors have been able to pinpoint that I survived because of it, or any of my friends who are abortion survivors. You know, I know of 160 survivors personally. You know, doctors have not ever looked upon our lives and said, oh, well, you know, this must be a plausible reason. There is no medical reason that people have been able to determine. I like to say I'm just a really blessed person. Because after I survived, you know, the words to my family over the years was that the abortionist gave the demands that I be left to die. What I know now is that it wasn't the abortionist who delivered me at the hospital in Sioux City. and gave the demands that I be left to die. It was actually my own grandmother, the nurse, who delivered me. And when they determined that the abortion had not succeeded in ending my life, it was my own grandmother who demanded that the nursing team leave me to die. I'm not the only child that has happened to in the world, and I won't be the last, unfortunately. You know, it's not one of those things we want to think about, especially even happening at hospitals. But I have friends who work in hospitals and have seen the children being left to die or have rallied for care to be provided to them. And that's what happened in my case. My medical records actually reflect that when I first survived, my APGAR score was pretty decent for a child who had no prenatal care given, who was supposed to be scalded to death and was born prematurely. And at the 5-minute mark, I was near death, which does reflect that, of course, I was left to die initially, until 2 nurses rallied against my own grandmother for medical care to be provided to me. And because they rallied for that medical care to be provided to me, you would never know it by looking at me today, right? If you passed me on the street, if you didn't see me on television shows, you would never know in a million years that I suffered what I did in the womb. And you would never know that when I first survived, I was fighting for my life. The doctors didn't believe that I was going to continue to live for very long because of the complications I was suffering from. I had severe respiratory and liver problems. I suffered from seizures for an extended period of time. I required multiple blood transfusions. I was too weak to suck from a bottle, and so my head was shaved from temple to temple, and I was fed through IV lines in my head. And the doctors, as I started to, of course, continue to live as the days passed, said, okay, she's continued to live, but if she continues, then she's going to suffer from multiple disabilities, ranging from being blind and deaf to having emotional and mental disabilities. I was transferred from the hospital in Sioux City, Iowa, then to the University of Iowa Hospitals, where I was cared for in the neonatal intensive care unit. And that's where my adoptive family first met me. I'm grateful for my family. You know, we live in a world today that talks about abortion being this normal, expected response to an unplanned pregnancy. And then when I hear people talk about adoption, what I usually hear people say is it's a terrible burden. I've had people say, you know, I could never give up my baby, but I'll abort them instead. For me, adoption was an amazing gift. And my family first met me when I was still in the neonatal intensive care unit there in Iowa City. And my parents sometimes show up on interviews that I do, and you can hear them tell the story of how the first time they met me, lying there in the incubator, my parents always say that the first time they met me, they fell in love with me. I'll be really honest, you guys, I was not a very pretty baby. I wasn't. The pictures are all over the place. You know, you can see I was just this little tiny girl full of tubes and wires fighting for her life. But my parents fell in love with me. And my mom always tells the story of how the first time she held me in the palm of her hand, because that's where I fit at the time, my mom says she knew that I was going to be okay. My parents loved me, and they believed in me. And I know it sounds strange, you know, coming from a stranger, and especially in the world we live in today, to say that love changes things, but love changed things in my life. Because I know that my parents' love for me dramatically changed my life forever. Because somebody cared about me, I was healed and whole enough to go home to my family just 3 months after I survived that abortion. 3 months. 1 out of 56 million lives lost to abortion in 40 years. And I'm standing here tonight, and I was healed enough to go home to my family within a short period of time. I know that's miraculous stuff. But it wasn't just my family that loved me and supported me. I've been really blessed in my life to know some of the medical professionals firsthand who cared for me. And I know how those nurses gave me a name when I was left nameless for months. How they knitted me clothing that I still have in my possession today. How that team of nurses fed me from a bottle even when they were told not to. You know, they did what they believed was the right thing for me. And I believe that I owe my life to them today. Because without that care, I wouldn't be standing here tonight. And I went home to my family, as I said, just 3 months after I survived that failed abortion. And I grew up in a little town in Iowa called Storm Lake. Anybody heard of it? Yeah, a couple people. I grew up in Storm Lake, and I grew up thinking I had a pretty normal life. I grew up knowing I was adopted. I can't ever point to a time in my life where I didn't know that, because our parents just always made it clear that adoption was a gift, and it meant that we were loved, not by them only, but also by our biological parents. And I say our because I have an older sister who's also adopted, because our adoptive parents actually struggled with infertility for over 15 years of their marriage. And so they adopted my older sister. She's from another family, and she's 4 years older than I am. And then they adopted me, no matter what they were told my life was going to look like or all the care that I was going to require. And then lo and behold, after 15 years of infertility, along came my little brother. And he's not adopted. And we were stunned by that. We didn't expect that in our family. What we expected our parents to say is that they were adopting another child. Because who wouldn't want to, right? That's what my sister and I were thinking growing up. I mean, look at how good this has turned out for everybody. But along came my little brother, and he rounded out our family. And that was my normal growing up, knowing that I was adopted, knowing I was born prematurely. What I didn't know was the deep, dark secret that our parents kept and never intended for me to find out, the abortion that I survived. But when I was 14, my world came crashing down, and all because my older sister faced an unplanned pregnancy herself as a high school student. My sister was 18, but she hadn't finished school yet. And even though we were raised in a home to know about the gift of adoption and the sanctity of life, like so many women in that position, my sister was contemplating having an abortion, and she was ready to follow through with it. But I'm grateful that she knew there was always somebody that she could turn to talk to about it, and that was our parents. And so it was 22 years ago that my sister told our parents about her unplanned pregnancy. And it was 22 years ago that they told her about my survival in the hopes that it would make an impact in her life. As I shared earlier, we kind of pass through this world thinking abortion doesn't really affect me. It's not anything I really need to think about or hear about. And the truth is, I was living in this home, my sister was living in this home, not knowing all those years just how much abortion had touched our lives. And so 22 years ago, she found out through our parents how closely it hit home to us. And of course, it was 22 years ago almost that my sister couldn't keep the secret from me. She didn't tell me everything, but she started to say something that had never been said in our house before. And it was an incredibly hurtful thing for her to say to me. But she kept saying, Melissa, at least my parents wanted me. And I kept thinking, how could that be? We're both adopted. We were both equally wanted. What I didn't know was that she knew the truth about my life. And I like to tell people, I wear mismatched shoes. I have one adoptee shoe and one abortion survivor shoe. And they are mismatched, and they are uncomfortable. And my sister and other people who are adopted are really lucky that they have a matched pair of shoes in adoption. I know it's not easy. If you're the birth parent, if you're the adoptee, if you're the adoptive parent, I know that adoption is not an easy situation. But what I always like to point out to people is that adoption is the option that everyone can live with. Everyone. That woman, that man, that child, and that extended family. And I could live with the gift of adoption that was given to me. But my sister is the one who led me on to ask our parents for more to the story about my life. And so it was a fall night, a lot like this, 22 years ago, that I sat our mother down and asked her to explain to me why it was that my sister was saying those things. People always ask me now, didn't you see this coming? No, I can honestly say no. I had no idea that people could survive abortions. I didn't ever suspect for a second that my biological parents would have considered it or been forced into it. So no, I didn't see this coming. And that night, 22 years ago, absolutely changed my life forever. There are no words for me to describe to you what it was like to hear my mother say, Melissa, your birth mother had an abortion during her pregnancy with you and you survived it. You know, there are no words. And I always have to be clear to people. You know, I was a feminist even at the age of 14. And that night rocked my world because I kept thinking, how can I be a feminist if I survived an abortion? Because all the feminists I knew had said, to be a feminist, you needed to be in favor of abortion. I hope that you know that there are feminists who are pro-life and that the first feminists were truly pro-life. And if you want to read more about that, you can visit feministsforlife.org. They are a great website based on the feminist foremothers. But I didn't know that 22 years ago. I started trying to reconcile my life, and I made a lot of mistakes along the way. You know, I'm not going to pretend for a second that living this life has been easy for me. I think one of the most difficult things for me when I came forward publicly as a survivor was when the media would ask my parents questions. And they'd say, oh, what was Melissa like growing up? And they said the most terrible thing. She was perfect. Are you kidding? No, I wasn't. What I was somebody who tried really hard to look perfect in the hopes that then nobody would look on the inside and see how much pain I was in. Because when I found out the truth about that abortion I survived, I was absolutely torn apart. I was angry because I couldn't understand how anybody could make that decision about my life. And I had to start grieving the loss of the life that I thought I had in order to accept the one that I was given. But as angry as I was, I'll be very honest in saying that I didn't stay angry at my biological family for long. You know, I didn't know all those years ago that my birth parents were forced into aborting me. But what I did know all those years ago in my heart was that I'm not a victim in this. You know, I'm blessed to be alive, to be given the gift of a family. And my faith tells me I was given the gift of an amazing purpose in this world. So what I felt from my birth parents was great sadness. But of course, as I worked through that sadness and all of that suffering, as I said, I made a lot of mistakes. I struggled with alcohol abuse and an eating disorder not long after I found out the truth, because all I wanted was to make what I felt on the inside go away. If I could just run away from the truth about my life, I would do anything to make it happen. And maybe some of you have been there and done that yourselves. Or maybe you know somebody else who is. And I can tell you that none of those things makes it go away. What it did was just create more problems in my life. And ultimately, I figured out as I kept, hitting my head on the proverbial brick wall, I realized, well, this isn't changing a thing. What I need to do is take responsibility for my own life and for my own healing. And for me, what that involved was stepping forward in knowing that I was supposed to do something with my life. I went to the University of South Dakota initially years and years ago. I feel so old when I'm around all of you, to be perfectly honest. But that's where I started my undergraduate degree when I was 19. And I, at that same time, started looking for my biological family. I was already starting to heal from the pain that I had experienced, and part of my healing was wanting to find my family so they could know that I knew the truth and that I wasn't angry. I had forgiven them, and I love them in this really weird way that sometimes people can't understand. I love them because they gave me life, no matter how that life began. And so I started looking for my family. And I also started working to obtain my medical records. The medical records make sense to most people because you're probably wondering the same thing everyone else does when you hear everything about my life thus far. You're thinking, is there something wrong with her tonight that we haven't seen yet, right? It's okay. This is when people can't look me in the eye. It's all right, guys. You don't have to be nervous. The truth is, no matter what the doctor said about what my life was going to look like, I'm perfectly healthy today. I've had no long-term complications from the abortion that I survived. And of those 160 survivors that I know and I work with, most survivors like me don't have any long-term health complications. Yes, there are a handful of people who have suffered major complications, as a result of what they survived. But most, if you passed them on the street, you would never guess that they are actual abortion survivors. You know, I know men who are prominent businessmen, who are in the media, who you would never suspect survived what they did and won't talk about it. You know, it's one of the greatest taboos that exists in the world, I think, to talk about abortion. And then to be the survivor of an abortion, yes, it is one of those things that most people don't talk about. But because I'm perfectly healthy, I knew that's why my medical records were going to be incredibly important if I ever came forward. You know, my undergraduate degree was in something totally different. I actually have an undergraduate degree in English education and Spanish. And then I ended up going back and getting my master's degree in social work. This is not what I ever intended to do with my life. You know, I knew obviously there was something I was supposed to do about my survival. But when people would suggest, you know, Melissa, you should talk about this publicly, my response was always, no, no, no. I'll do anything except that. I mean, what is the world going to do to me? What are people going to think? What are they going to say? You know, all I have to do is open the newspaper or flip on the computer every single day, and I hear and see people saying things like, doesn't have a soul yet. It's not yet a human. You can get rid of that one. Another one will come along someday. You know, when people say those kind of things, they're actually talking about me, even though they aren't even aware of that. And so I was scared to death to come forward because I wasn't sure what it was going to be like. But I knew it was important that I came forward. But I wanted to find my family first, and it took me 10 years to find them. And it took me 10 years to finally obtain my medical records. And I learned a lot in those 10 years. And even though I grew up in Storm Lake, Iowa, during those 10 years, I actually moved to Sioux City, Iowa, the same place where my biological mother's abortion had taken place. I knew that, but I never suspected that it would come to play in my life later on, but it most certainly has. But during those 10 years, you know, I did everything humanly possible to find my biological family and try to obtain my medical records. You know, that's now a lot of the work that I do is helping other people try to achieve those tasks. But time and time again, no matter all the investigation that I did, I'd find little bits and pieces here and there, but never all of the information that I was looking for. And finally, in 2007, I tried one final time to obtain my medical records because time after time, when I would contact the hospitals, they would just say, there's nothing, there's nothing. And I had both my given name through my adoption and my biological name. But I tried one last time in 2007, and I finally obtained my medical records. Most abortion survivors don't have anything in their records included about what they survived. It's usually something that's passed along through their family. But in my case, my medical records do document the abortion that I survived. And you can see copies of my medical records on my website. My website's very simple, as long as you can spell my last name. It's Melissa Ohden, OHDEN.com. And on the photos page of my website, you can see copies of my medical records. And in them, they say things like, a saline infusion for an abortion was done, but was unsuccessful. Isn't that an interesting statement? My life solely resulted from something being unsuccessful. That is not the plan for any of us, folks. I'm here to tell you that. And I don't want anybody in the world to be saying that other people's lives are not a success. You know, I've had people actually attack me on the internet and say, gosh, what a shame she lived. Now she can talk about it. Couldn't her mother do anything right? She couldn't even kill her properly. That's the world that we live in some days. But I also believe that there's a lot of courage that exists behind the keyboard that doesn't exist right here face to face. But in those medical records, not only was I able to read more about the abortion that I survived and how I fought for my life, but I ultimately found my biological family. Because after 10 years of looking for them, and in those 10 years, I even worked for the adoption agency that handled my adoption. That's how wild my life has been. And I spent days in my office thinking, I could find that file. I could go looking for them. I know where to find them, but I never did. And because I think I was patient enough to wait it out, I found my biological parents through my medical records because they committed a huge HIPAA violation when they sent them to me. They actually forgot to black out my birth parents' names in my medical records. Whoops. We call that a HIPAA violation. I choose to call that divine intervention, folks. Trust me. Because after 10 years of searching and doing things my way, I was ready to come forward. And so there were my birth parents' names right there in my medical records. And I jumped on the computer that same night, and I learned that I was living in the very same city as my own biological father. I had moved to Sioux City to finish my master's degree, never suspecting for a second that decades later my biological family was there. And there he was. And after 10 years of looking for him, I had to wait for a couple of months before I could gather the courage to contact him. And in the summer of 2007, I did. I sent him a letter to his office and not his house because I didn't know if he had told anybody in his life about me. I had done enough investigation to know that he had a teenage daughter and he was married. And so I sent my letter to his office thinking maybe that would protect him a little bit. And I sent that letter off telling him all the things I've told you all tonight. You know, that I'm alive and I'm well and I know the truth and I'm not angry. And I'm incredibly blessed to be alive. And I said, you know, I'll be waiting to hear from you. If you ever want to have contact with me, I'll be waiting. And 6 years later, I'm still waiting. And I suspected that might happen. You know, I knew the likelihood was pretty great that my biological parents might not want to hear from me. But as you're going to hear about in a second, it just gets more complicated. Because abortion complicates our lives. It doesn't simplify things. You know, I always hear people who are pro-abortion say things like, you know, life will be better. You can go on from that. Maybe for some people you can, but most people I know of haven't been able to move on. It isn't just one decision set in time. It's a decision that has a ripple effect for years and generations to come. And that's certainly what I've experienced in my biological family's life. I didn't hear back from my biological father that summer, and I turned my sights on my biological mother's family right after that. I couldn't find my birth mother through my searching, because even though my parents were engaged when that unplanned pregnancy took place, their relationship ended after the abortion, like so many relationships do. Abortion doesn't fix or save relationships. By and large, it ends them, and it certainly complicates them. And so my birth parents' relationship was ended, and so I couldn't find her. I didn't know her married name. But I had discovered who her parents were, my grandparents, that grandmother that forced the abortion upon her and delivered me and demanded I be left to die. I sent them a letter the summer of 2007, not knowing then the role that they played in the abortion taking place. But you know, if I would have known then what I know now, I still would have sent it, because I think they needed to hear from me more than my own biological mother even needed to, because they had lived their lives not knowing what had happened to me after the abortion. For all they knew, I could have died not long afterwards, or I had suffered all the complications that people thought that I was going to. So I sent them a letter, and I asked them to contact my biological mother on my behalf. Since I hadn't heard from my biological father, I never expected to hear back from them, but I did. It was my grandfather who responded to my letter in return. And the very first thing he said in his letter was that he knew, I knew, my live birth was not the intention that day at the hospital. That was a pretty courageous thing for him to admit to. And in that letter, he also courageously admitted to a couple of other things. He told me that, first of all, my biological mother had never told anyone about the abortion that she had. And I don't fault her for that. You know, I think we live in a kind of mixed up world that wants to say that abortion is a choice and a right, but then wants to silence the voices of people who might say otherwise. And I know a lot of women who carry the secret of abortion with them throughout their life. So I know my biological mother is not alone in that. But he also admitted in that letter that that message of forgiveness I was asking them to pass along to my biological mother wasn't going to be passed, because in recent years they had become estranged from my biological mother. And I didn't understand it at the time, but I understand it now. And maybe you can too. If it wasn't her choice to have the abortion, that was meant to end my life and dramatically changed hers. It was theirs, and it was forced. It makes great sense that their relationships have been forever changed. And I see it in families around the world. Whether it's talked about or not, abortion changes families. Relationships are forever changed. Communication is sometimes severed and changed. It happens in a lot of families. And so that was the last time I heard from my biological grandparents, was back in 2007. That's also when I came forward publicly as a survivor for the first time. Even though I felt completely unprepared to speak about this publicly, the first time I shared my story was out on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. for a press briefing. And I'll never forget being out there thinking, this is a great opportunity, but I'm probably never going to do this again. I'm sick to my stomach. I'm a bundle of nerves. I am not cut out for this public speaking thing. And I went home and told my husband, that I had this really bad case of nerves when I was speaking. And what we found out just a few days later was that I didn't have a really bad case of nerves. What I actually had was a really bad case of morning sickness with our daughter, who is now 5. I was just a few days pregnant with Olivia that first time I shared my story publicly, which I know is not a coincidence, as nothing in my life has ever been a coincidence. And it was during my pregnancy with her that I got more involved in pro-life work. As I shared, I have a master's degree in social work. And people had told me, you need to be prepared to give up your career for your calling. And I kept thinking, no, I like the life that I created for myself, thank you very much. But I learned, of course, as I was traveling mainly to college campuses at the time, how important it is to be involved in pro-life ministry, particularly on college campuses. Feminists for Life's data will tell you that approximately 10% of college-age women become pregnant in any given year. And I think I'm right. I did a little bit of research before I came here tonight. There's almost 25,000 women on campus here in the Twin Cities. Does that sound right? So about any given year, 2,500 college-age women could become pregnant here on your campus. Has anybody ever seen, do you think, 2,500 pregnant women on campus in any given year? No. How many do you think you've seen? 2. Yeah, usually I hear 1, like there's 1. I was talking to Alicia on our way here tonight. There are 2 pregnancy centers nearby the campus that folks can turn to for assistance. The university has a couple of co-ops for family and married housing, which are also great support, and there's also a student help center. So there are many great things happening here on your campus that many universities don't have. But the truth is, a lot of folks don't know that they exist, and they don't know how to access them. And so whether you are pro-life or you're pro-choice, I think this is something everybody can rally around to say, we need to get the word out. We need to let people know what resources exist for people who are in need here on campus. And I'm sure Alicia can give you more information if people need to know more about those resources. But that's what I did during my pregnancy with Olivia. I got more involved, mainly on college campuses, advocating for them to really take a look and see how friendly they are to pregnant and parenting students. Because what I typically hear from students is, I feel like I have to make a choice between my education and my child, or I have to make a decision between my job and my child. And that's not empowering. If we want to believe in empowerment, then we need to believe in empowering and giving resources and support so decisions can likewise be made. And what I didn't know is that as I was engaging in that pro-life work, my birth father was back home in Iowa, and he was fighting for his. That's why my biological father never responded to the letter that I sent him, because he passed away about 6 months after I sent it. And it was a very untimely passing. My birth father was only 51 when he passed away. And I didn't know about it right away. My husband likes to joke that I used to stalk my biological father. I Googled him a lot. I like to just think I Googled people before a lot of other folks did. But my husband was always warning me. He said, Melissa, one of these times you're going to come across something that you wish that you hadn't. And that time when I Googled my birth father's name, I certainly did come across something that I didn't want to. And that was his obituary in the local newspaper. And I couldn't understand it. You know, I spent 10 years of my life looking for my biological father. And then to find him, and we were living in the same city, to lose him, I couldn't understand how that was the plan. That wasn't the plan that I had set up in my mind. But I knew that I needed to be patient and see how all of it unfolded. What I didn't know is that there was probably no other way for the truth about my survival to come to light to my birth father's family. Because just as my biological mother had kept the abortion a secret, so did my biological father, and he carried it to his grave. When he passed away, his family went to clean out his office, the place that I had sent the letter, thinking I was shielding him. They found the letter. He had received it. I had always wondered if he had. He had received it, read it, and he kept it in his top desk drawer. And I have no doubt that he was probably going to respond to it someday. But he ran out of some days. And so there was that letter when he passed away, and they found it, and they uncovered the great secret that he had kept. I didn't know it, but they were looking for me, and I was actually looking for them because I gathered names from the obituary. And even though I, again, was scared to death, thinking, Melissa, you don't know these people. You don't know if they know anything about this. But I thought, you know, I want them to at least know that a piece of him is alive in this world. Maybe that can give them some peace at this time that they are grieving. They didn't respond. The uncle that I had selected didn't respond to the letter that I sent him, but I didn't know they were looking for me. And our paths crossed right after our daughter Olivia was born. She just happened to be born in Sioux City, Iowa 5 years ago at the very same hospital where my life was supposed to end. And trust me, I didn't want to do that. I was ready to waddle right out of that hospital, actually. But my husband and I had gone there for our birthing class thinking, I don't think I can do this. And that's what I kept telling the doctors. Out of all the things you ask me to do, this is probably the one that I can't. I would just love to go somewhere else. And they said, you know, this is the best hospital. Can you try it? So my husband and I went to our birthing class, and we sat there for almost 2 hours waiting for someone to show up and teach it. And I thought, that's the sign I've been waiting for. I am not supposed to be here. And before I could leave that hospital, suddenly a nurse showed up to teach our birthing class, and she sat us all down and apologized and said, you know, it's not bad weather that prevented me from getting here. They just forgot to schedule somebody. So they went down our nursing roster until somebody would say yes. And as you can gather, we weren't the most pleased group of people that day, all waiting for a birthing class to start. But she said, listen, I'll make it up to you, I promise. I've worked here since the mid-1970s, and I have a lot of wisdom that I can impart to you. I survived that abortion in 1977. So you can imagine how I was squirming in my seat when the nurse said she had worked there since the mid-1970s. And my husband was squirming in his seat because he knew exactly what I was thinking. And he kept saying, Melissa, sit down. I know it. I know what you're going to do. Don't. Please don't. And I didn't do it right then, but I followed the nurse to the bathroom that day. I had to wash my hands before lunch, guys. I may have also taken her shoe off because I was following her that closely in there. But I told her that day who I was and what I had survived. And when I told her, the tears just started to fall down her face. She said, of course I know who you are. You look just like your grandmother. Of course, she had known my grandmother, the nurse, who had been at that hospital and orchestrated everything. But I never suspected, once again, that I would ever meet someone who knew my biological family and who could, of course, understand the connection. And that day as we were leaving, she said, you know, Melissa, we just never wanted you to know. The doctors and nurses here, we never wanted you to find out. And I just had to tell her, I said, you know what, I thank you enough for caring about me, but I wouldn't have it any other way. And I wouldn't. This is as much a part of me as everything else. And so that's why I ultimately gave birth to Olivia at that hospital, because I knew that was the sign that I had been waiting for. And I'm grateful for that. I used to be scared of that hospital. You know, that may sound strange to some people, but I always knew what had happened there. And now that hospital has been forever changed. It holds the most beautiful memories of my life. And it wasn't long after Olivia was born there that my biological father's family finally connected with me. I didn't know that they had actually sent me a message on the internet, but I received a card not long after Olivia was born, and it was my great aunt. She's my grandmother's youngest sister on my biological father's side of the family. And then not long after that, my grandfather came knocking at the door. So now I have a relationship with my grandfather and my great aunt on my biological father's side of the family. But it's been really hard. As much as I have a great relationship with them, my own grandmother, who's still married to my grandfather, has never been able to bring herself to meet me because she feels guilty that she couldn't save me, that her own son carried the secret of an abortion to his grave, and she can look upon his life and see how it affected him. His first marriage ended because she wanted to have children, and he became ambivalent about it, which is a fairly common reaction after an abortion for people's perceptions to change about parenting children after that. They could see through some of the statements that he made when he talked about doing something he was so ashamed of that he would never tell anybody about it. They know now what that was. And it's hard because I may never have the opportunity to meet my grandmother or my half-sister who's a teenager, or my aunts and uncles, my cousins. We lived right there in the same city for over 5 years. But I know that that's what I needed to show the world, is that abortion 36 years ago didn't just change my life and my biological mother's. It changed everyone's lives, whether they knew about it or not. And I know the day will come when my family hopefully will be healed to the extent that I've been. But I hadn't heard from my biological mother's family since 2007 when my grandparents sent that letter. And I had kind of been comfortable with the fact that I may never hear from them. But just this past spring, a family member reached out to me. She is a cousin of mine. She was about 15 when the abortion took place. And she reached out to me. And she's the one who told me the truth about my grandmother delivering me. She also told me, unfortunately, that my survival was kept a secret from my biological parents. My biological mother lived over 30 years of her life believing that I had died that day in the abortion. And I know that leads to more questions than answers. Trust me, I run them through my head every single day. Like, how am I adopted then if they weren't told of my survival? Well, if the abortion could be forced upon my biological mother and done under the radar of procedures at the hospital, I'm pretty sure my adoption could be handled in a multitude of ways also. But I can honestly tell you that my biological mother's life was shattered by believing that I had died that day. I have contact with a half-sister of mine who talks about how she always knew there was something different about her mother, something that she couldn't pinpoint. There was a pain that she didn't understand, something they didn't talk about. And she could see how my biological mother struggled sometimes in terms of parenting and connecting with other people, but she didn't know. And the truth about my survival didn't come to light until I had reached out to my grandparents through that letter. And that's when the secrets became harder and harder for people to keep under wraps. And so now I've been really blessed in my life to not only have contact with my cousin, but also my half-sister. And on my 36th birthday this past year, my own biological mother sent me an email for the first time. Her first statement was, 36 years ago today, you were robbed from me. And I was. For her to be forced to abort her firstborn child and then have her survival kept a secret. Yeah, I'm sure to her it does feel like I was absolutely robbed from her. But my biological mother has finally started to accept the fact that I'm not angry with her. For her, her greatest regret in life is that she didn't run away from her own family. Can you imagine that being your greatest regret? That you didn't run away from your family? And unfortunately, I've met a lot of women like my biological mother who suffer from that same regret, thinking if only they could have gotten away from that person who was forcing them to make that decision. But I am pleased that my biological mother supports me in what I do. I gave up my career to do whatever it was I was intended to do with my survival. And for me, that means coming to college campuses and sharing my life story. It means helping pregnancy centers and other organizations that support women and children, helping them to raise funds so that they can serve people in your community. But my biological mother is incredibly grateful that I am willing to do this. And as I struggled this year with finding out these pieces about my grandmother being responsible and the great secret that was kept, I kept saying, I can't talk about these things. You know, there are just certain things that I won't ever be able to speak of publicly. And it's my biological mother that has been saying, Melissa, I need you to do this. You are the first person who has ever stood up for me in this world. The child who was supposed to die through the abortion is the one who is standing up for her biological mother. That turns the world on its head. But I am also now not only the child who lived, who was helping her biological mother, but I'm also a mother myself. You know, as I shared, our daughter is 5 years old, and she has grown up knowing what happened to me. As much as we have tried to shield her from the truth, she knows things inherently, as kids do. And I will tell you that nothing is more painful for me than to have to look at my own child every single day and know that she never would have lived. You know, people say, yeah, Melissa, there's a lot of what ifs in this world. That is true. But for me, there shouldn't be a what if to my child existing because someone else made the decision that I should die. And if we've lost 56 million children to abortion in 40 years, then how many children like our Olivia have never come into that world because of that one abortion? You know, we're talking hundreds of millions of children. We're talking about hundreds of millions of men and women whose lives have been forever changed. Hundreds of millions of grandparents like mine, aunts and uncles, cousins and siblings that have been forever changed by abortion. And so that's what I call the ripple effect of abortion. It leaves no one untouched and for generations to come. But I hope no matter where you stand on the issue of being pro-life or pro-choice, what you can take away from tonight is that we are all affected in some way, shape, or form. And no matter where you stand on the issue, there is always something you can do to get involved here in your community to make a difference in somebody else's life. So, I saw that the food has been delivered, so before we get to that, I'll open it up to questions for anybody. And if you ask me a question, I'm going to repeat it back through the microphone so people can hear it, and then I'll answer it for you. And then I promise we will get to food. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for sharing your really amazing story. I appreciate it so much. I was wondering, how do you feel about the timing of your adoptive parents sharing the story? It seemed like you really had to press them to finally share it.
Yeah.
And how would you do it differently if you were in that situation?
Yeah, he was asking, by the way, about the timing for when I found out about surviving the abortion, and do I kind of wish it was different? I do, to the extent that being 14 is really difficult in general, but it's really interesting for me. Out of the survivors that I work with and know, some of the survivors were actually raised in their biological families who attempted to abort them. And so when they found out, the majority of them were also teenagers. So there is something really, there's this commonality in all of our lives. Most of us find out when we're teenagers. So I think part of it too is that search for self. So in that respect, I was grateful to know it then because I was trying to figure out who I was. But at the same time, you just don't have the emotional and mental capabilities to deal with something like that. But I can't imagine finding out as an adult. I almost think that would have been harder because I would have felt like I knew who I was, and then all of that changed. So no, finding out as a teenager was incredibly difficult. But I'm grateful that our parents told my sister. My nephew is 21 and has a daughter of his own because she did choose life after she found out how much abortion had really affected our family. So thank you for that question. Yeah, in the back.
If you were to see your maternal grandmother,
And you're good. You've got this down. I saw you searching for the word, like, which part of the family?
what would you want to ask her or say?
That's such a great question. If I could, if I had the opportunity to meet my maternal grandmother, and my grandmother has passed away. I found that out recently, and I think that's what's given her side of the family a little bit of opportunity to come forward. I think my greatest question would be, why keep it a secret? That's really the hardest part for me. because I feel like I know she knew the scientific basis for when life begins. I know she saw me kicking and screaming and fighting for my life. I know how angry she was at my existence. And I know a lot of grandparents who are in a similar position, whether they are delivering their grandchildren or not. There are family members who have a strong reaction to an unplanned pregnancy. But for me, the greatest question is, why could you not have told them? Because I know the damage that it's caused. Even still in my biological mother's family, there are people who may never speak to one another again because of the pain that they've experienced and, how the responsibility gets tossed around. So yeah, I think the greatest question would be, why could you not have told them? And, think about that for a second, you guys. When I contacted my biological father and he doesn't respond, what is the reason why he probably didn't? Because he was probably shocked, because he had lived his life believing that I had died. So I can only imagine he must have thought it was some hoax, how somebody could have found something out and send him this letter posing to be this child. He had to have been absolutely stunned, just as my biological mother was. So yeah, my greatest question would be, why could you not have told them? Because our lives could have been so different. And I think in my biological mother's opinion, because I'm watching as she's starting to try to work through all of this, I think that's one of the most difficult pieces for her, even though she relives everything that happened to her. The fact that she didn't know that I survived and I was taken away from her, that could have been a turning point in all of our lives, but we weren't given that opportunity. Yeah, in the back.
How do you rationalize your existence against, how far you've come against the odds?
Overwhelming? Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's wild. People always say, one of the funny statements about me, there's a lot of funny statements about me, but usually people will say things like, did you see her? She looks perfectly normal. I know. Trust me. I've woken up in the same body for 36 years, and I'm stunned by that. So yes, it is very surreal. And especially with these final pieces that have rolled out, I had come to accept all of those pieces about my life and kind of embrace them. But these last pieces are like part of a Lifetime movie, like the abortion that's kept a secret and it's forced on somebody. And that's really surreal for me, because I like a normal, simple, quiet life. And so, yeah, these pieces are really wild for me. Yes, I do. The question was, do I have a spiritual faith? And yes, I was raised in a Christian home. That certainly helps me make sense of why I'm here. And my faith gets me through it. My life doesn't make sense. It doesn't, I don't have a problem saying that out loud. My life doesn't make sense, not just in terms of my existence, but all of those things that are not a coincidence in my life, the people that I have met, all of how I've been connected to my biological family. But my faith tells me that it makes absolute sense, and I'm grateful for that. So that's what gets me by and keeps me sane. I mean, truly, truly keeps me sane, and I'm thankful for that. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for women who maybe were in this position that your mother was in, where their parents or their boyfriend are forcing them to force something they don't want?
She was asking if I have any advice for someone who's in a similar position to my biological mother's, if someone is forcing them. And, because I do the work that I do, I get contacted by people regularly who are saying, I've got somebody that I'm working with, and it's their parent, it's the boyfriend, it's the husband, they are forcing them, and, we need to mobilize people to reach out to them to help them. And I would say, if you know of somebody, you may be the one who can say, no matter what somebody else is trying to force you to do, there is another choice. There is. And there are people who can help you. And I may not have all the answers, but I can help you find somebody who does have the answers. So it's going to the pregnancy center. Maybe it's contacting somebody in the student group if you don't know who to reach out to. You know, there is always somebody who is going to be willing to help someone. But I know when you're in that position, you feel like there's nowhere to turn, or I know in my birth mother's case, she felt like there was no way she could go against what her parents were saying. And as you can probably gather, my grandmother essentially kind of ruled with an iron fist. And so it was not normal for people to stand up to my maternal grandmother. And so, you know, my birth mother's statement on my birthday this year, she said, you know, Melissa, I look at you and I see your strength, and I like to think that maybe some of that came from me. But she said, you know, 36 years ago, I was a doormat. I let people walk all over me. And look what happened because I let them walk over me. But she said, you know, I've learned a lot, and I'm different now. But I think a lot of people are in that position and feel like they're powerless. But by letting people know that there are resources, there are other choices, there is support that exists, that does empower people to let them know that there is another way. Thank you for that question. And if if people have questions that you feel like are too personal or you don't want to talk about in front of everybody, please know that, you can talk to me after this too. You want to turn it loose for food, Alicia? Okay.
Okay. Well, first of all, can we just thank Melissa once again for her awesome testimony? All right, so there's Herbert and Gerberts in the back. You can feel free to stick around. If you have any questions about Students for Human Life, feel free to talk to me. I would love to talk to you about it. And also, like Melissa said, if you have any personal questions for her, you're more than welcome to ask her. All right.